Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It's been 6 years since the death of Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex offender who died by suicide in jail, or, depending on what you believe, was murdered to keep potentially sinister truths about America's ruling class hidden. Unproven conspiracy theories about Epstein's life and death have swirled around right-wing circles since. What information did investigators gather on Epstein? Who else knew about his sexual abuse of teen girls? But now, it's not just conservative conspiracists beating the Epstein drum. The case has recently occupied a remarkable amount of government time and attention, leaving a president who once peddled these very conspiracies for political gain with a problem he can't seem to solve. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to Dave Levinthal, an investigative journalist based in Washington, about why the Epstein case has turned into a political fireball and how this story might end. Dave, thanks so much for making time. I really appreciate it.
Hey, Caryn, it's a pleasure to be with you.
I guess the big question here is, how does a sexual predator who has been dead for 6 years suddenly dominate the national conversation again? Just bring us up to speed. Why did the Epstein story blow up now?
Jeffrey Epstein, of course, died in 2019, but his legacy, his terrible legacy, lived on for many years after that, in large part because of Donald Trump and many of Donald Trump's top supporters. They were, in a way, obsessed with the quote-unquote Epstein files, this so-called list of powerful people, wealthy people, politically connected people, many of whom they thought would be Democrats, and they used this as sort of a conspiracy fire that was constantly stoked by people including Dan Bongino, Donald Trump's now deputy director of the FBI, Kash Patel, now the director of the FBI, Pam Bondi, Donald Trump's new attorney general, and then Donald Trump himself, including Donald Trump's family members who kept bringing this up. This was all part of a kind of a broader push by Donald Trump to play in the sandbox of conspiracy. Let's remember the Barack Obama birth certificate conspiracy and various other things that Donald Trump has said, say nothing of stolen elections and the QAnon phenomenon. And this was red meat for many of his supporters who he was relying on to come back into power. So when you add this all up together, it may seem crazy that Jeffrey Epstein is even a thing right now, that we're talking about Jeffrey Epstein, but it makes a lot of sense just given the past 6 years of run up and almost drip, drip, drip to this point when it has become, of course, a massive political liability for Donald Trump based on his potential association with Jeffrey Epstein in a way that even goes above and beyond what we already know, which was that they had quite a close friendship, at least going for a while during the late 1990s and early 2000s.
So in essence, Trump and his subordinates, they come into office promising all these new revelations about the case. His Justice Department reviews the case, then concludes there's no new information. The DOJ says there's no Epstein client list, as you mentioned, that Trump and his administration had hyped up. So then this all backfires on Trump.
Well, Donald Trump, during the 2024 campaign, said, I would release the Epstein files, whatever those are. And his supporters love that. And in fact, his supporters demanded it. And of course, when Donald Trump became president of the United States, this was one of the things on a very long list of grievances that Donald Trump's MAGA supporters had against previous administrations, including Joe Biden's administration, and that they saw Donald Trump as sort of a knight in shining armor fighting for their cause. And again, on that list, the release of the Epstein files. So Pam Bondi, who became the attorney general shortly after Donald Trump took his oath of inauguration, back in January, she said, hey, I paraphrase, the list is on my desk. And she seemed prepared and poised and ready to release it. So when Donald Trump, a few months later, basically told his supporters, look, there's nothing to see here. Let's move on. Jeffrey Epstein is long dead. We don't need to worry about Jeffrey Epstein anymore. this kind of caused a bit of a short-circuiting, and I understate the case greatly. Many of his supporters just didn't know what to think of it, that Donald Trump, who they saw as that almost Rosetta Stone to unraveling the mystery of what the Jeffrey Epstein situation truly was in essence pulling a 180 and telling them not to worry about it. So either one thing had to be true, that they were being lied to all along, or that Donald Trump was somehow part of this conspiracy. Now, that was the thinking among many of many of Donald Trump's supporters as it relates to Jeffrey Epstein. What we know to be true right now is that Donald Trump has done his darndest to try to get beyond this, to try to move beyond this, to try to push this away and focus on any of 101 other things that we could be focusing on as a country, as a nation, as a world. And that ranges from tariffs on Canada and the rest of the world to, hey, should we deport actors and actresses in the United States like Rosie O'Donnell, and just about everything in between. But it hasn't worked. And that's why still today, in the heat of summer, in August, even though Congress has gone away for vacation and it's recess, we're still all talking about the Epstein files. Donald Trump this has been the one liability that he's just not been able to outpace, at least to this point.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that point because the case has certainly now evolved beyond conspiracy. As you mentioned, it's overshadowing these really important, critical policy issues facing America's leaders today. Like you mentioned, the tariffs, like the collapse, for instance, of the ceasefire talks in Gaza. And yet it's the Epstein story that is dominating the political discourse on Capitol Hill. Why does Congress get involved?
Yeah, and you could add so many other things to that, the situation in Gaza, in Israel, Russia, in Ukraine, in addition to many domestic issues here in the United States that are of extreme concern, even grave concern to people, particularly as it relates to economic issues, pocketbook issues, being able to make ends meet for Americans who just simply don't have what they need to live their daily lives. And so the fact that we're talking about it is not surprising because Donald Trump has not been able to provide basically an adequate answer to his supporters, and also to, you have members of Congress who have gotten involved in this in a way that cuts against what Donald Trump perhaps would want, and serious enough to the point where key White House officials, top Trump administration officials, met this past week and did so talking not about the economy or about tariffs, but talking about the Epstein files. So as we go into the 2026 midterm elections, because here in the United States, our campaigns just simply never end, this is something that when you talk to political strategists in particular, they're concerned about, at least on Donald Trump's behalf, that this is just going to be the one issue that dogs him for not days or weeks, but months or even years.
It's kind of a little bit like the story of Frankenstein. Like you help build the monster and then it comes back to get you. Like Trump rode kind of the paranoid politics of MAGA into power, and now it's backfiring on him.
Yeah, conspiracy theories are great and convenient for you if they're working in your direction, and they are sort of the ultimate double-edged sword. And if you suddenly find yourself crosswise with the very people who are believing it. And let's not gloss over some very real facts about the Jeffrey Epstein case. Jeffrey Epstein was, by every account, an absolutely despicable human being who did horrible things and whose victims are many, and whose victims are beginning to speak out in ways that they haven't before, now that this has come back into the public consciousness in the way that it has over the past several months. So I think you can expect to hear from more and more people who were trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein, allegedly, who were victims of his abuse. And Ghislaine Maxwell, his co-conspirator and former girlfriend, who is serving 20 years, a 20-year sentence in prison. She's very much back in the mix, too, because she, number one, is trying to get her case taken all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court to, in essence, be reheard, because she says that she didn't get a fair trial and that it was wrong for her to be convicted in the fashion that she was. Also, too, you have people in Congress, in part, who want to hear from her and want her to testify and provide information that could be relevant to getting to the bottom of what this Jeffrey Epstein situation is truly all about. So Donald Trump has been masterful at controlling the Republican Party. He has been masterful at controlling individual members of the Republican Party in Congress. But this is the one issue where members of Congress are sort of going off on their own a little bit. And even though they're not here in Washington, D.C. right now, passing laws and debating issues, they're going to be back in September. And it is highly unlikely, I think it's fair to say, that the Epstein issue is just simply going to dissipate and go away in the interim.
I want to return to the Ghislaine Maxwell stuff in just a bit, but I want to ask you first, why do Republicans turn on Trump on this issue?
Well, they've turned on Trump in a certain way and then not in another way. And what I mean by that is that the fact that they are continuing to focus on the issue in a way is in and of itself doing what Donald Trump doesn't want, which is put more focus and more attention and give more oxygen to this fire that continues to burn about Jeffrey Epstein. But at the same time, too, you have some Republicans, including key Republicans on committees, that can compel testimony from people before their committee. Some of those people are Democrats. It includes Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, former government officials in the Biden administration, the Obama administration, as well as some officials that served under Donald Trump. And the crux of their question appears to be, hey, what did you know at that time? If the FBI has information or the government has information that will shed more light on the Jeffrey Epstein situation, well, why didn't you act on it then? Or what did you know then that we should know now? Expect those types of questions, and that line of questioning to be part of what we're going to hear a lot more of come September and in the autumn of this year.
On the issue of those subpoenas that were issued, one of those congressional committees had the uncomfortable position of issuing a subpoena for the Epstein files from the Justice Department. It's now given it till August 19th to hand over those requested records. How do you expect the DOJ to respond?
Yeah, that's quite a $64,000 question, to say the least. And when a congressional committee subpoenas anyone, whether that's an individual or whether that's a government agency, they are supposed to respond. And there are consequences potentially for not responding. You can imagine that there is going to be quite a conversation, even a negotiation between the two parties as to what that testimony will look like, the extent of it. And you have people who are, in essence, both on Team Trump, who are a bit on opposite sides here. You have Republicans who are in Congress, and then you have a Justice Department that Donald Trump oversees and controls in a way that I wouldn't say is unprecedented in U.S. history, but pretty darn close to. And Donald Trump has made it very clear that he wants to have a great deal of control over law enforcement in general in this country. So for the Department of Justice to do something that it might not necessarily be what Donald Trump wants, well, that wouldn't have been surprising under a previous administration where there was much more of an independent spirit to the Department of Justice and some daylight between the president and the people who are running the Department of Justice. But that window or that gap is very, very small at this point. So that's going to be a kind of a little subplot or subdrama to this raging story that just will not stop.
Does that mean the Trump administration could be forced to release those files?
It potentially could be, or talk about them, so or characterize them under oath in a public setting, in a public fashion, although it is possible and conceivable that this could be private testimony too. There's a couple of different ways that this could go, but just giving the burning hot spotlight that is on this issue and sort of the insatiable appetite for the American public to know more as well, whether they are Trump supporters or Trump haters, it seems likely that there's going to have to be something that the public is given, because the public, in essence, is demanding it, particularly on the doorstep of, yet again, another election cycle.
If there is nothing in those files, though, that the DOJ says would change the, essential understanding of this case, What then would the public even learn from the release of more information?
Yeah, and that's a big question. Now, let's remember that a few weeks back, Donald Trump and his administration said, well, hey, we're going to move to try to get grand jury testimony related to Jeffrey Epstein released publicly. And first of all, it's very dubious as to whether there would be any information that would be new or revelatory from that. And also, ultimately, what's going to come of that request that they've made. But what we're talking about when we talk about the Epstein files is something separate and apart and likely much more voluminous. And these are files that law enforcement independently has collected, that the FBI, that the Department of Justice would be privy to. And what ultimately could be in there? Well, there could be a great deal of information. And that's really why so many people are trying to get a hold of that, or I say colloquially, but get information or get that information released out into the public domain so that not only lawmakers and politicians can know what happened, but the American public can know what happened as well. And that can be dangerous too, because whether we're talking about this or any type of criminal investigation or criminal situation, there are victims that are part and parcel of this. And there can be some collateral human damage in a very, very real way. So as much as everyone wants to know everything, if there are details about what happened or crimes that occurred or people who were hurt and people who were injured, and more details are coming out about them that force them, in essence, to relive what was a horrible, horrible situation for them and for their loved ones, we have to be sensitive to that and expect that too to be part of this discussion, especially those who are, in essence, victim advocates and those who want to make sure that people who Jeffrey Epstein hurt in one way or another aren't being hurt again by information that's coming out as part of this rush to release the Epstein files and release information related to Jeffrey Epstein.
I want to ask you about Ghislaine Maxwell because the DOJ and the Trump administration, they're trying to appease demands for more disclosure, but by essentially turning their attention to Maxwell. She was supposed to, have congressional testimony on Monday, but that's been indefinitely postponed. She's, of course, also against having the grand jury testimony released. I guess, where does she fit into all of this? And does that actually appease the public if we get more information from her? Does that actually appease the public in saying, okay, we have what we need?
So her name gets thrown around so often. Let's remember that she was sent to prison for allegedly and then ultimately being found guilty for taking children and women and in essence trafficking them to Jeffrey Epstein so that they could be abused. Okay, so that's who we're talking about when we're talking about Ghislaine Maxwell in this context. So could she be very useful, however, to the causes and the entities that are seeking more information about Jeffrey Epstein himself? Ostensibly, yes, but this is a very dangerous political situation and legal situation and ethical situation that all parties are going to have to navigate at the same time when she is looking out for herself and her own interests and trying to get out of prison and doing so all the way up to the highest court in the land in the form of the U.S. Supreme Court. So the stakes are very high, not to sound cliche, but it's true. And where this all lands are several variables that, as you just noted, the fact that congressional testimony potentially would have happened, but that got postponed. Well, why? Because she is trying to continue her case forward and potentially get a reprieve. There is the question, too, of whether Donald Trump would use his pardon power to pardon Ghislaine Maxwell, effectively in exchange for her providing information about Jeffrey Epstein in a way that might help Donald Trump. Now, none of that we know to be the case. We have absolutely no evidence to suggest at this point that Donald Trump is going to do that or would do this. But this is a president who has used the pardon power in extraordinary ways, ways that we've never seen before in U.S. history. He pardoned effectively every January 6th rioter, attackers of the U.S. Capitol, people who assaulted police officers, people who were present on January 6th attacking the U.S. Capitol in Donald Trump's name, and wiped away their convictions. They are free. They are no longer in prison. They are no longer on trial. So that was something that if we were having this conversation less than 5 years ago, that would have seemed nonsensical, impossible. But yet it seems within the realm of possibility that Donald Trump could potentially use his pardon power in any way he sees fit. And he does have that constitutional power and ability to do so. So to bring it back to Ghislaine Maxwell, expect that too to be something that gets discussed at length. And that is a massive political gamble for Donald Trump if he's thinking about doing it, which again, there is no evidence to suggest that something like that is imminent, even if it is within the realm of possibility.
So what does Trump, I guess, when you consider those ethical and precarious considerations and the high stakes involved, what does Trump have to do to satisfy the demands for transparency and ultimately put this issue behind him?
Well, he's going to be watching the poll numbers very, very closely and seeing if his base is beginning to truly turn on him or sour on him, or people who are more or less Donald Trump supporters, even if they're not Republicans, but they're conservative independents, people who like him, they like everything else that he's doing. If this becomes a liability in such a sense that things are going in a bad direction, not only for Donald Trump, who's not facing re-election himself, but the second half of his second term is going to be very contingent on Republicans holding power, which they have right now, in the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. He has to look out for that. He has to look out, number one, for himself, which we know he will, but also to his agenda, his entire second term in office by supporting Republicans. And if they're not getting the support they need to win re-election, to retain power in Congress, then something's going to have to give, or Donald Trump doesn't do that at his own great peril and the peril of his own party. What would that look like? How would that manifest itself? It could be by making additional concessions, like the release of the grand jury testimony seems to be intended to be. Would there be other orders that he would tell the Justice Department, hey, you have to do this. I am ordering you as president to go ahead and do this. That too could be within the realm of possibility, although we haven't quite gotten there yet. So Donald Trump has a suite of options, if you will, and he seems to sort of be carefully ticking through them at a very slow pace to see what might be the best way without giving up everything and just simply capitulating to what, mind you, are major calls from Democrats right now who have used this issue as a bludgeon against Donald Trump and accusing him of hiding things because, according to at least some Democrats, his opponents, that Donald Trump may be implicated in all of this, that he may appear in the Epstein files, that his palling around with Jeffrey Epstein back in the 90s and early 2000s, there's more than meets the eye there, and that Donald Trump isn't telling the whole story. That's sort of the rub with Democrats and in using and weaponizing all of this, if you will, against Donald Trump, very much in that political context as well.
Yeah, what are the political risks for Democrats? Because I think a lot of people are questioning, well, why didn't you do anything when Joe Biden was in office? Why didn't you, open the case and look into it yourself? Like, why seize on it now?
Yeah, that is exactly the risk for them, that what they're doing right now is opportunistic and empty and hollow. At least the criticism is those things, because, hey, if this was such a big deal for you back in the day, well, yeah, why didn't you do anything when you had power in the U.S. House of Representatives and could have done what Republicans seem to be doing now, which is having congressional committees go and investigate it and hold hearings on this issue? Why didn't the Biden administration, the Department of Justice under Joe Biden, be more aggressive in trying to get to the bottom of this and determine what the Epstein files truly were, and if there were all of these powerful oligarchs and business people and politicians and political leaders who were associated with Jeffrey Epstein in a way that nobody knew about, at least publicly. So that is a criticism that is relevant to all of this, and one that you can expect to hear more back from Republicans against Democrats when you hear from different Democrats, including top Democratic leaders, about the Epstein files and what Donald Trump should or should not do.
Dave, in your estimation, how does this story end?
That's
a loaded question.
And an impossible question to answer at this point. And I'm not punting here. I'm just stating what we know to be true, which is that we don't know the truth. So all of these investigations, I think what we can say at this point, and what we do know in a concrete way, is that this is, number one, not going away anytime soon, that this is something that is probably the biggest challenge for Donald Trump during the early part of his second term in office. And number three, that this could be a major political liability for Republicans, and depending on how the Democrats play their cards, could come back to bite Democrats a little bit too if they try to overplay their hands. So the fact that we also have a legal situation going on with Ghislaine Maxwell, and we have a legislative element running parallel to this in Congress, and all the things that are happening in the executive branch simultaneously at the same time, is a recipe for this staying in the public domain and the public's consciousness and the public eye for many, many months to come, until we do ultimately start getting some sort of answers that will satiate the public or otherwise get answers to these questions that are pretty hot and burning, not just for Donald Trump supporters, but for Donald Trump detractors as well.
Dave, thank you so much for the work that you do and for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Caryn.
That was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks for listening.